So let me start by introducing myself. I work at Autodesk, and I'm a mother of a furry husky. I have previously contributed to a PHP source and a documentation as well. And I'm really just another curious developer who is presenting to you today. And I built GitAmp with these cool people using AMP.php. And this is a website where you can listen to music generated by events that are taken across GitHub. It was really fun to work on. And I also host and maintain HeapSpace, where I have an open-grok installation that is regularly pulling and indexing many repositories that are found under the PHP organization on GitHub. And this is a source code search and cross-reference engine. So it's really helpful when you are learning about PHP internals or developing for PHP internals or for an extension. So you might find it useful. Now, as Amir mentioned, this is my very first talk, so please bear with me as I present to you today. So, in this talk, we will cover why you should contribute to PHP and really to any other open source project, and a variety of ways you can contribute to PHP is going to be the main topic I'm exploring here. And finally, we will also talk a bit about how to and how not to collaborate on open source projects, and that's going to be how we close up. So by the end of this talk, hopefully you will discover, well, mainly various ways you can help PHP project and how contributing to PHP does not just mean writing code, and especially that it doesn't necessarily require you to write C code or any other language that you may have no experience in, and how being curious alone can help you and your favorite project to actually evolve, and a few do's and don'ts when collaborating. So let's get started with this. Why you should contribute to any open source project. Why does anyone contribute? Okay, if you have ever wondered how that one awesome project you saw is able to achieve non-blocking concurrency, or how your favorite framework is able to create those objects and their dependencies as for requested services, or how that one built-in function you use almost daily is able to do what it does under the hood, then you've been one decision away from discovering that at a deeper level. The transparency of open source projects lets anyone to just take a deep dive into a repository and learn by reading the source code, try things out, and attempt to make things better. So, yeah, with every new feature added, every change introduced to your favorite project, there's at least one person in the entire universe that is getting really excited to find out how that works. So the next time you find yourself as that person, that curious person, do take that decision and follow along the learning curve when you find some time. You'll see that it will be rewarding. It's also a great opportunity to collaborate with your peers online and to learn a lot more about what you know already. My very first open source contribution was for someone else's side project. A group of really cool developers were building this chatbot for the Stack Overflow PHP chat room. And I got really excited about it the first time I saw it. Initially, though, I had this fear in me that I was going to make silly mistakes, and but the excitement I had to actually play with this chatbot and improve it if I can was at a higher level than the sphere itself. So I turned it into a side project for myself as well and created new commands for it. And I had so much fun doing so. Throughout that period, I created multiple pull requests, adding more commands to the plugin, to the chatbot, and I received so many comments about my code, and these were all to improve the code I was proposing, the plugins I was writing. And this kind of an experience really teaches you a lot about communicating about your code. And you receive improvement suggestions and counter arguments, and all of these really add to your experience as a developer. Now, okay, now let's talk a bit about how does collaborating online grows you as a developer. One thing for sure is that you get to communicate about your code, as mentioned. The good thing about it is that us developers, we tend to write more code than we talk about it. And conveying the aim you have to introduce a change and receiving counter arguments about it or agreements about it, this is really adding to your experience. Besides that, you take part in code reviews, and together with the reviewer or yourself, you get to try improving a piece of code to make it a lot more efficient. And besides that, you might want to mention this one project you contributed to in your resume or in an interview. And just by wondering how a certain change was introduced in a way that retains backwards compatibility, or how a completely new language expression or operator was implemented, and how other languages provide the same feature. Thinking about these things actually teach you a lot about language design as well. Similarly, keeping this sort of a mindset towards your favorite framework or library also teaches you a lot about application design and API design. So, if you would like to contribute, let's review a few ways you can contribute to the PHP project. Now, the first one is that you can report bugs that you discovered. This one happens almost naturally. So you wake up to a bright new day and you see a completely new PHP version is released. Excitedly, you upgrade and suddenly your tests fail. What do you do? I'll tell you what I did when this happened to me. We were introducing certain validation rules into one of our projects, and some of these validation rules included checking if a given hostname has a valid A, CNAME, or MX record. And when we wrote the tests for these, we have noticed that no matter what hostname you provided them, they returned true, always. And initially, we treated this as a bug in our own code. So we went on to checking our implementation for these. And when we looked at our implementation, we saw that the entire code was actually depending on two of these built-in functions and nothing else. So we all tried to reproduce this locally. That's the first thing we did. And when we did so, we saw that we were able to get the actual results we were expecting when we provided an invalid hostname. And at that point, we realized that the only difference between our machines and the production pipelines were that the pipelines were based on this very tiny Alpine image. So the only difference was the operating system that this code was running. So given all this knowledge, we thought that this is a bug upstream to be reported. And I went on to find similar bug reports on bugs.php.net and bumped into this very specific one. And the operating system matched, and it specifically said it is always returning true on another DNS record checking method. So this looked very suspicious to me, and I went on checking the Alpine bug tracker that was provided on the bug report, and there I found that there was already a pull request created to fix this in the PHP source code. And the pull request was already actually merged. So all we needed to do was wait until the next PHP release, which at the time for us was 7.4.9. And until then, we decided to skip those tests. So sometime later, PHP 7.4.9 was released, and we upgraded to it right away. And when we run our test again on skipping them, we saw that 2 out of the 3 methods that we were skipping, the ones that used the check DNS method, they were now successfully executing. And the only one that failed was the MX test. So something did not seem fully right yet. So we went back to the bugs.php.net, and I created a new bug report here mentioning all the findings and how this went for us before and after the new release that included the bug fix. And I also went to the pull request that was already merged and mentioned that I filed this new bug report that is related to this PR. And the author actually confirmed it. Later on, Nikita made a change to fix the remainder of this bug, and all was well in the world again. So to sum up the steps I've taken through this experience, the best thing you can do when you bump into an actual bug is to reproduce and make sure that it is a legit bug, and do so in a short, self-contained, compilable example that reproduces the same problem. And the second best thing you can do is actually checking for existing reports. There are so many duplicates in the bugs.php.net, and it's been up there, the bug tracker has been up there for a long time. So there's a high chance that someone else also bumped into this issue. You can also check GitHub pull request to see whether there's an existing attempt to fix this problem. And if there's an existing report or a work in progress, do try to be helpful by sharing your own findings, and otherwise do report a new bug. And either way, make sure to actually follow up when you have more information. Now, the second way you can contribute to the PHP project is by testing the source code of the PHP project. This is also how I started out. My very first contribution to the PHP project was writing a test for an interesting looking bug that I saw on the bug tracker. And anyone who knows how to code in PHP can actually write a PHP test for the source. Now let's take a look at how these tests actually look like. How does the Phpt structure looks like? The Phpt file is made up in different sections, and it must start with the test section. This is where you define a simple single-line title for your test. And if it's about reproducing a bug, then you start with the bug number at the beginning. And if you really need to describe more about the test, then you can use the optional description section. Then in the file section, we write out the PHP code that needs to be tested. And finally, the expect section is where we write out the exact output our file section should be producing. Now, there's many more sections that you can use. And for this, you can check out qa.php.net, write test PHP. There are many others that you can use. We will look at a few other sections that are quite common when you check the tests that are currently in the PHP source. If you need to define certain ini settings for your test, you can do so by using the ini tag, ini section. And instead of an expect, you can also expect a specific error to be produced by your code in the file section. And to do so, we use the expectf section. Now, the basic tests for the PHP functionality, the basic functionality, go under the test directory of the PHP source. And different extensions are, the tests for different extensions belong to the test directory under their own place in the PHP source. Here's another interesting, very common section that you can use, which is skip if. You can say if this extension is not loaded, then skip this test. This is very common when writing tests for extensions. The test for engine behavior go under the Zen tests, and opcache tests also go under the opcache on extension directory in the PHP source. Now, let's say you wrote certain tests, and how do you run these? The PHP source comes with the run tests PHP file, and you can use this file to run all the entire test suite PHP has. And before doing so, you will need to define the PHP executable that run tests PHP should be using. You can also pass the -P flag to tell run test PHP to use the PHP that is invoking the script. And you can choose to run the tests on a specific folder or multiple folders as well. And there's more to learn about this in the PHP internals book in the test section. Now you have another way to run these tests using the makefile. If you clone the PHP source code and you compile it, then you end up with makefile. And you can use the make test command, the test target, to basically run test PHP, but it will do the definition of which PHP executable it should be using for you. At the same time, it will set up some useful flags for the run test PHP to basically do it in the best way it can. And you can define a specific test to run, or you can define different directories of tests to run as well. Now, this is how you write and run tests, but how do you end up finding what to test? One good way for myself so far has been actually watching out for interesting bugs, like how I ended up writing the PHP test for this bug that is mentioning for each causing an infinite loop. Now, this bug interested me specifically because it's using constructs like for each, while, and if that we use every day. So I was really wondering how this happened to be. So first thing I did was trying to reproduce this bug. And I tried it in multiple minor versions of PHP 7.1 back in that day, and it did not work out. So I went back to the bug report and said, okay, I cannot reproduce this. And then the author mentioned that you should be running this test, the code that was shared, in a function. Okay, the next day I tried out and I find out that this is actually happening, and not just in PHP FPM, but it behaves completely the same on CLI as well, and having opcache enabled. So I went ahead and wrote this PHP test. And as you can see, it's very simple. The file section here is the exact same code that the author mentioned that is causing the bug. And I have enabled opcache and in the ini settings, also enabled it for CLI, and I set the optimization level to 0. And as you can see, I named my test to include the exact bug number and the bug title, and I set my expectations for the output. Now, I pull requested this, and later on, someone was able to actually fix the bug and test it with this PHP test that I provided. Now, even though you don't know how to fix the bug that you found in the source code yourself, by doing the initial reproducing of the bug, you definitely know and can say that it's a legitimate bug, and you confirm it. And then by writing the test for it, you can actually give the next person the ability to test out their potential solution within the PHP source code and make sure that it works. Nowadays, this is a very recent effort. We also have CodeCove.io set up. A scheduled job on Azure pipeline setup of the PHP source repository builds, generates, and uploads line coverage to CodeCove.io as a setup step. So if you do have some experience in writing C, you could also find this useful in finding which parts of the source code is not tested enough, and perhaps provide tests for it. Now, let's talk about the PHP manual and how it gets maintained. This is by far, documentation of a big project is by far the biggest maintenance burden on any big project. And for PHP, documentation takes place mainly on editphp.net. Nowadays, there are also mirrors on GitHub, but this has been for a long time the place to do so. And you can already log in using your GitHub account and make some changes to both the documentation and the translations, and request a review on them. And someone who has a commit access and karma to actually push those changes to the Subversion repository that hosts the PHP documentation can definitely review and push those changes. Now, The PHP manual is written in DocBook, and DocBook is a semantic markup language that is mainly made for writing technical documentations for hardware and software. And we have a whole tutorial on doc.php.net/tutorial for those who want to learn more about how they can use DocBook and PHP to contribute. So the manual is written in DocBook, and it is built by PHP's own DocBook 5 rendering system, which is called a PhD. You can also find all the information about PhD on the tutorial page. Now, the format, the XML format for the PHP documentation pages, it looks like this. And you can see that for every single part of a function signature, we can define specific keywords that will be highlighted in a specific way. As you can see, we are here defining the visibility modifiers, we're defining the types, the method names, the parameters, and we can also use predefined entities like the style.procedural that you see here. These can be shared across, reused across the documentation for that specific translation. Now, this piece of XML gets rendered as this, which is pretty decent. If you want to look at it on a side-by-side, this is probably a better view. And this is why I think DocBook is really nice, because you can just define every single bit of the function signature and different parts of it. Now, that's how it looks like, and that's how you prepare the documentation. What needs documenting when it comes to a PHP project, or actually probably many big open source projects out there? So consider this. All the internals people worked hard to get you all the new and shiny features that have landed on the PHP 8 release, right? Now, how do people know how to actually use those features in detail? They can read the RFCs, right? But there's a whole manual that should be the place for this, right? So every single feature that gets introduced to the language needs to be documented fully. And similarly, all the changes that are introduced to existing functionality and functions, these changes need to be made on those existing documentation pages as well. So they need to be kept up to date. Everything that gets deprecated and removed, they need to be mentioned. Changes to extensions as well, because those are also kept as part of the PHP manual. Besides all these, you also have an entire set of bug reports at bugs.php.net. They come in the category of documentation problems. These are bug reports about unclear documentation or perhaps wrongly worded documentation. So those also need to be maintained and improved. And these are the main people that have been contributing into the maintenance of PHP manual in the recent times. This link shrinks and grows over time, of course, but for the amount of work there is to do, it is a very tiny list. Christoph and George are all-around contributors to both the documentation and the source code, and they're out there almost daily reviewing pull requests and changes to the documentation. Peter, until not long ago, he was known as the manual author and the editor, and he recently stepped down, but until that time, like for about 5 years, he has been contributing to maintaining the documentation tremendously. Andreas has been putting a lot of effort in moving the PHP documentation from Subversion to Git, and thanks to his efforts, the PHP project has been accepting pull requests to the main English documentation through the GitHub mirrors. And as you can see, there has been so many pull requests that have been already reviewed and merged, and there's still so many that are in progress. And I also contributed to the PHP 8 one, I think, very recently, and it was documenting named arguments. As you can see, Christoph and George are the reviewers there, and they helped me draft up the initial documentation for this. And there's a whole PHP 8 documentation tracker issue on this repository, and there's a lot more of unchecked boxes to do on this list. So even today, you could pick up something to document and just pull request it. Now, we talked about the English documentation and how this is working currently. Let's talk a bit about translations. And this is the current state of translations. So if you look at this graph, you will see that only the Spanish, French, Japanese, and Russian translations have over 50%, even more, of files that are up to date. Now, we are at PHPKonf, so I'm going to point out to the Turkish translations. As you can see, the files up-to-date percentage is at 8. Now, if we look at more general stats, we will see that the files that need translation is over 8,000. And this makes up 72% of the existing files in the Turkish translations. And 21% of the files are completely outdated, or perhaps partly outdated. So just the 5% of the files are kept up to date so far. And this is the list of current translation group. And in the most recent years, as I've seen on the SVN history, there's only one single person in this entire list, which is Nilgün Belmar Bugüner, who has been contributing to the translations for longer than 12 years, I think. And the most recent contributions has been done only by these people. So consider these percentages again and how many people are actively working on it. And there's an ongoing effort to also move the translations, also mirror the translations over GitHub so that people can create pull requests to maintain it more. So when that happens, I expect all these numbers to be a lot better. And well, you don't really need to wait for that to happen, and you can already go to the edit.php.net and log in with your GitHub account and pick up a few files that need translation or update from the menu here. And please make sure to read this Turkish documentation, Turkish translations information file here, because it does mention the keywords that are selected for certain words to be kept completely the same throughout the translations. And there's one thing I really noticed here. The emails of many of the translators that are listed here, this domain points to the Turkish working group of Linux documentation. So it could be that for so long, this working group has taken on the translations of PHP language as a project for themselves, and they have put in tremendous effort so far. But I am not sure how active they are, and perhaps if you would like to contribute, this is something for you to find out, and perhaps contact the team leader, who seems to be Nilgün Belma Bugunar, and find out ways to get more people to contribute. In the end, PHP Project is a community effort. So the more people help with the documentation, the more people help with the translations, and the more people actually contribute to the source, the better the PHP project will get to be. Now, let's talk a bit about how you should be contributing and collaborating, and how not to collaborate on open source projects. First thing to keep in mind is that maintainers are busy and real people. We are meeting plenty of them today. They also have jobs and families and perhaps an appointment to catch, like we all do. So when you are trying to be helpful in contributing and when you are reporting issues, do keep this in mind and do not be demanding. Now, many projects come with guides on how you should be contributing, how can you create pull requests, what to watch out, what to expect, certain rules to keep. And this one is for the PHP project. You can find this within the PHP source code. And if you would like to contribute to the source code, you can start from here. And many projects also come with issue templates provided by the maintainers. And it is very important to actually provide all the requested information on the issue templates so that the maintainers can actually help you, especially when you are reporting a bug. They know how to help you, what you went through, what have been your findings, and literally you are helping them help you by following this template. Now, definitely don't be that person who goes to a repository and says, this doesn't work. Now, saying this alone won't help you in any way. It also won't help the maintainer to help remediate this problem in no way, shape, or form. So we are looking at one example of this that took place in Composer. And you can see the frustration of the maintainer here. Well, fortunately, for the same problem on the same day, this maintainer have received another report that actually provided a way to reproduce the issue. And as you can see, that has been the main thing they were asking for the entire time. Can someone try to figure out where the issue is? Provide me an easy way I can reproduce this. So if you do so, if you start, when you have a bug, if you start by creating a easy, self-contained easy to compile, self-contained, minimal example of this bug and report all your findings about it, then you actually make sure that someone else can definitely replicate the same issue, reproduce it, and try to work on a fix on it. If you want things to be fixed, start by that. For PHP, we have this how to report page on bugs.php.net. And this gives you a good first set of things to watch out. And the most important thing, again, to mention here is that first thing you should do when you visit bugs.php.net to report a bug, start by checking existing bugs, whether there's already a report for this. If so, go ahead with that and provide your findings there. Try to be helpful in the work that has been in progress. And make sure to actually describe how you can reproduce this problem in the PHP source if you are reporting a new bug. Now, not always your aim for contributing a project will match the maintainer goals. When we look at this specific pull request to PHP documentation, you're going to see that on the first line of the comment from the author, we have a grammar mistake corrected. So far, so good. And then they request the pull request to be accepted because their aim is to win a contest. They signed up to GitHub just today. And if you consider this from the maintainer of PHP documentation's perspective, no. The maintainer's goal here is to improve the documentation. You might be actually trying to be helpful because you aim to win a contest, but that tone is not going to match the maintainer's goals. There are better ways to do this. Now, we're looking at a very detailed and big effort in proposing certain big improvements to the PHP documentation here in this pull request. And as you can see, all the improvements that are committed in this pull request are described completely. Reasonings are given and what else to do is given. And don't be tricked by how much of this PR I was able to fit into this slide, but there are actually 17 separate improvements to MySQLi extensions here. And the maintainer, the author of the pull request, did this in a way that every single change is in a separate commit, so that if one of them was not applicable, then they could be skipped. And you will see here that the maintainer actually really appreciated this. And the way the pull request was structured actually worked out because there were certain parts that were skipped for now. And yeah, this one is a really good example of introducing big improvements on a PR. And this makes up for my talk. I will be uploading the slides later on in the day. And if you have further questions, I'm happy to answer them. If you want to contribute to the PHP documentation or the translations, I would be happy to help you out in getting started. And yeah, thank you for having me today.